Kia ora koutou, ko James toko ingoa. Hola todos, mi nombre es James, and Lafa Math. Greetings in Scots Gaelic.
Kia ora. My name is Claudio Aguayo from Auckland University of Technology.
Today we're going to be opening a discussion and exploration around the potential of the theories and epistemology of the Santiago School of Cognition to enhance mixed reality education design. So just to give you an overview, we're going to start with a bit of background into mixed reality or XR in education and the Anthropocene. We're going to be looking into the theories underpinning the Santiago School of Cognition, haptic and sensory design in XR education, and understanding Indigenous worldviews through embodied cognition and haptic design.
Okay, let's start with this concept of mixed reality or XR in education in the context of the Anthropocene. So first, we need to introduce this concept of the reality-virtuality continuum. Back in 1994, Milgram and Kishino introduced this concept of mixed reality as MR, which entails the continuum that goes from the real environment all the way on the left hand to the other side of the continuum or the digital or virtual environment. Mixed reality in this context refers to the fusing of real and virtual worlds to create an integrated environment that incorporates the physical and the digital. On the left side, we have the real world represented by a farmer. Then we have an increasing degree of digitalization represented first by 360 images or 360 videos, followed by augmented reality, then augmented virtuality or the merging of real world objects into virtual worlds, and finally the virtual reality end, characterized by CGI or computer-generated worlds. Since the introduction of this concept by Milgram and Kishino, today we refer to mixed reality as XR, which purposely includes both the real world and the virtual world and as part of the continuum. So when defining mixed reality as XR, we are purposely including the real world and the fully digital world.
So XR environments can be especially powerful within learning contexts as they can assist learners to partake in genuine investigations in the real world. In other words, they can engage users' bodies in real-world interactions, as well as digital interactions on screens and with technology, and puts digital information and content into real-world spaces. XR enables the reconnecting of people and communities to location and in turn can promote ecological literacy. So the case study project we're looking at here is called Pippi's World, and it was an XR research project which looked to enhance marine science and marine ecological literacy for a group of primary school students on an education outside the classroom trip to the Goat Island Marine Reserve and the Science Learning Centre up at the reserve. An XR intervention was developed inside the Marine Science Learning Centre to complement and enhance the more traditional museum-style displays, and the real-life snorkeling experience was also included within this intervention. So this diagram here illustrates how mixed reality was conceived of within this intervention. We had everything from the completely real Goat Island snorkeling, real-world hands-on experience, an interactive art plus science participatory kelp forest experience, which focused on haptics and gamified elements to engage the students. There was the augmented reality components, which was the Goat Island Pippi's World app, moving into virtual reality with 360-degree photos and videos, both above the Goat Island Marine Reserve taken with drones and underneath the water, and then a fully immersive virtual reality environment. So we had the snorkeling trip, examples of the augmented reality experience, the 360-degree photos and videos, the Pippi's World virtual reality experience, and the art science non-digital haptic participatory kelp forest experience. So these types of learning environments are incredibly immersive, and XR allows for the creation of these hybrid learning situations in which virtual and real objects and experiences are combined.
Right. This brings us to what is known as the Santiago School of Cognition. The Santiago School of Cognition is founded on the work by Humberto Maturana and Francisco Varela. This theory can be encapsulated in two sentences. Living systems are cognitive systems, and living as a process is a process of cognition. The Santiago School is founded on this notion of autopoiesis. Autopoiesis literally means self-making. We have what is known an autopoietic unit. We also have the environment at the bottom and an interaction occurring between the organism and the environment. This interaction produces what we know in the theory as structural coupling, meaning both units, the environment and the organism, come together into a shared action. If the environment changes, the organism changes or adapts accordingly. Another key concept coming from the Santiago School is what is known as enaction. Enaction is the idea that organisms create their own experience through their actions. Organisms are not passive receivers of input or information available in the environment. They are active actors in the environment. It is an active process of sensorial and motor action. Enaction is closely related to embodied cognition. In this regard, from an enactive perspective, the process of cognition is not unique to the brain, but also to the body. Coming from these two important concepts, autopoiesis and enaction, and this notion of embodied cognition, the Santiago School can provide very valuable principles to XR in education, as we can encourage learners to interact with the environment while becoming with the world in a circular experiential flow.
Taking cue from the notion of embodiment, this provides impetus and a need for emphasis on sensory and physical ways of knowing when designing for XR. Embodied design can also facilitate the creation of tangible, authentic, hands-on, and self-determined, in other words, heutagogy learning experiences. So that brings us to our third point, haptic and sensory design in XR education. And the question of how can we better develop the haptic and sensory components of XR learning through the concepts of embodiment and enaction. Haptic learning is the way in which humans actively construct and develop our experience and understanding of the world through the active touch sense. And the field also includes kinesthetic information, which is how meaning is constructed through the body's movement and occupation within space. So within XR research and design, the physical, non-digital, and the haptic has been previously dismissed. It's an area that researchers have suggested requires more investigation and focus. One way in which the sensory and the haptic can be embedded within XR projects more thoroughly is through sensory mapping as a research method. So within ecological and environmental XR educational design, sensory mapping provides a unique method for developing non-digital, aesthetic, and embodied knowings and understandings, especially of natural environments. Sensory mapping involves the documentation and noting down of sensory experiences at a particular location to understand the environment in deeper ways. These sensory experiences are then mapped and expanded upon in creative, artistic, and interpretive ways. Haptics and touch-based understandings of location can allow for the designer to embody and understand the location more deeply in a felt way, and can allow for embodied learning to occur more readily. So the embodied and sensory ways of knowing an environmental location through haptic sensory mapping can then be transplanted into the design of the final educational physical outcome. The kelp forest experience you can see here acts to stimulate the senses, haptics, and then tie these experiences to scientific and ecological learning about marine ecology and humans' connection to the environment. So this brings us to our final point. So there is intrinsic connections between the holistic, interconnected, indigenous way of viewing the world and the Santiago School of Cognition. Both don't subscribe to the Western materialist, reductionist ways of viewing the body and environments as compartmentalized into different components. There's an emphasis on holism within both ways of viewing the world. Across indigenous cultures, there's a focus on embodied interaction and sensory ways of knowing environment. Indigenous knowing and indigenous worldviews can act to reorientate the designer to feel interconnected with nature and then take these experiences into the design process. The Santiago School can act as an intermediary point between Western scientific understandings and indigenous epistemologies. And the Santiago School originally stemmed from empirical scientific traditions. However, as a systemic theory, it aligns closer to holistic and interconnected indigenous ways of knowing.
Here we argue that there's a pressing need to establish new relationships with nature in the face of climate change and wicked problems we're facing today. And indigenous perspectives brought forth through the Santiago School and the notion of embodied cognition can offer new forms of learning in XR environments. Embodied learning connected with indigenous worldviews can allow for deeper connections to be formed between learners and their learning contexts. This holds special power for connecting people to environments and nature, breaking from Western ways of conceptualizing and separating the human and the environment, or the body and the mind. This relationship between indigenous worldviews and the Santiago School is only emerging, and there is still much work to be done. So, as a summary of this presentation, here we offer a contribution to the field of XR in education, design, through the introduction of some novel ways for art and science, such as sensory mapping and haptic learning design. In addition, engagement with embodied forms of learning connected with indigenous worldviews can allow for deeper connections to be formed between learners and the context in which the learning takes place. And finally, we postulate here that the notion of embodiment and enaction from the Santiago School are conducive to accessing and bringing forth indigenous cosmologies within XR education. Thank you very much for your attention.